Other issues that we might encounter during an audit and some special issues. So we start with the general approach that we've got an unmodified opinion, but we're going to add a paragraph. We can add either an emphasis of matter paragraph, or we can add an other matter paragraph. Emphasis of matter, and we'll go through each one of those. Common situations we have to deal with are consistency. So consistency in this case with respect to the application of generally accepted accounting principles, or IFRS if that's the appropriate framework. We can also deal with going concern issues, other information, required supplementary information, and then we've got some other emphasis of matter issues to potentially consider. Okay, consistency. Consistency has to do with a change in accounting principle. When we change accounting principles or the methods by which we comply with the accounting principles, then we have a lack of consistency. The adjustments, one situation is where we got misstatements in prior financial statements, and we have to address that. So types of changes in accounting principle would be where we had a GAAP principle we were following, and then we moved to a different GAAP principle that makes a material effect on the financial statements. We need to make some sort of disclosure of those in the audit report. So that would be an acceptable GAAP to an acceptable GAAP situation. Occasionally, we'll have a change in the form of the reporting entity. Maybe it changed its legal form from a partnership to a corporation, or from a partnership to a different form of partnership. So we may need to address that in the audit report. We also have accounting principle changes where we go from non-GAAP to GAAP. We pick up the financial statements. We realize that on the first pass that they were not following GAAP. Now they're following GAAP. And so we've got a consistency issue with respect to the prior period. And what we don't see here is GAAP to non-GAAP. If the company were to go from a generally accepted accounting principle or a method that follows GAAP to a method that fails to follow GAAP, we would not issue an unmodified report. Rather, we would issue an adverse opinion if they went from GAAP to non-GAAP, and that's why we don't see it listed here. Accounting principle, occasionally we'll run into a situation where the accounting principle change is inseparable from a change in accounting estimates. And so on those, we will, it's not a GAAP departure, so we can issue an unmodified opinion, but we're going to add a paragraph to address that. So let's look at these consistency issues. With consistency issues, we're going to add a paragraph following the opinion paragraph that's going to make an emphasis of the matter. Now, we can, in some cases, issue a qualified opinion. That is where we have a GAAP departure. If the change from GAAP to GAAP is not justified, then we're going to issue a qualified opinion. Worst case, if we could go to non-GAAP, we'd issue an adverse opinion, but typically what we're going to end up with in these situations is a qualified opinion. The change isn't justified. The financial statement, the effect on the financial statement is not pervasive. So these financial statements are prepared in accordance with GAAP, consistently applied, except for to carve out the qualification. When we have a GAAP to GAAP change, recall that GAAP tells us we're going to compute the cumulative effect of the change in accounting principle, and we're going to issue the unqualified opinion. But it'll have the CCAP in the financial statements, and then the audit report needs to make reference to that change as well. All right, going concern uncertainties are a particularly troubling area for auditors in practice. So the auditors in practice, when you issue the audit opinion as part of your work, you're going to evaluate whether there is substantial doubt about the likelihood of the company continuing to exist for longer than 1 year. If the company is not likely to continue to exist for longer than 1 year, then we don't use our normal GAAP procedures. For example, depreciation expense and historical cost no longer make sense if we're not going to be around for more than a year. Those kind of situations where it doesn't look like we're going to be around for a year, then assets such as property, plant, and equipment should be on the books at net realizable value rather than historical cost less allowance for depreciation. Current assets and current liabilities, those definitions don't make sense as well if we don't expect the company to be around for a year or longer. If there's a going concern issue, then we're going to add a paragraph under the opinion paragraph. We're still going to issue the unmodified opinion, but we're going to add an emphasis of matter paragraph. In the most serious cases of uncertainty, that is a very high degree of uncertainty about the continuation, we may issue a disclaimer of opinion. So the language would indicate that there's substantial doubt, and we like to use the language substantial doubt and going concern. So going concern, the phrase, is a kind of a term of art for accountants. Now, here's the issue for practicing accountants. When you've got a company that's you're performing an audit services for, that company is in financial distress, you have a catch-22. A catch-22 problem is a problem that formally the solution is inherent in the problem itself. It's an informally, we refer to those as a no-win or absurd problem, a catch-22 problem. Now, the reference to catch-22 is a literary reference to Joseph Heller's book, written in 1961, about pilots in the World War II that were being asked to fly particularly risky missions. Many of the pilots would go out, get shot down, and never return. The idea with the catch-22 in Joseph Heller's book was, if a pilot's crazy, he doesn't have to fly the mission. We don't, after all, want crazy pilots flying a risky mission. Therefore, one must be crazy to fly. The catch was, if a pilot's got to ask for a medical excuse to not fly, the act of asking for the medical excuse is evidence that the pilot is not crazy. Therefore, the pilot has to fly. The solution is inherent in the problem itself, a catch-22. The catch-22 with going concern issues is this. You've got a client that's in financial distress. If they get a clean opinion, the financial distress may continue or it may be resolved. If you issue an opinion with the emphasis of matter that they're in financial distress, as an auditor, you may in fact trigger the resolution of that financial distress in an unfavorable fashion. You may shut the company down because the employees may leave, the suppliers may cut the company off, creditors may cut the company off or trigger calls on debt and that sort of a thing. So a going concern opinion can trigger a significant degree of financial distress. One way to think about it, in the crisis management literature, we talk about smoldering crises and acute crises. When you've got a company that's in some form of financial distress, you may have a smoldering crisis, but when you issue the going concern opinion, you trigger an acute crisis. Moral of that story is to accept audit engagements with companies that are making money and have really good long-term prospects. All right, non-financial statement information. It's very common for audited financial statements to be issued and to have additional information accompanying those. In the case of SEC clients, the client firm has to issue management discussion and analysis. The management discussion and analysis is not part of the financial statements and the notes to the financial statements, but it's issued simultaneously and oftentimes in the same release. What's our responsibility with respect to auditors of that information? On that information, the accompanying information, not part of the financial statements, not part of the notes to the financial statements, but something that accompanies that, we don't have to audit that information, but we do have to review that information. We do have to examine that information. Probably shouldn't use the term review, to make sure that it's not inconsistent with the financial statements. If it is inconsistent, then I might have to revise my opinion on the financial statements, or I might have to add an emphasis of matter paragraph. In practical terms, what does that mean? As an auditor, you're going to perform your audit, you're going to get it all ready to go, And then you're going to ask to look over the accompanying financial information, like management's discussion and analysis of the financial results. If there's something that's inconsistent with the audited financial statements, then you're going to ask the client to revise that. It's a rare occasion where the client won't revise that, because if the client doesn't revise the accompanying information to make it consistent, then you're going to have to revise your opinion. That's not a good outcome. But it does require additional work for the auditors to look over the accompanying information, not perform audit procedures, but to make sure that the information is not inconsistent. Now, in some cases, there's required supplementary information. Required supplementary information might be a situation where the SEC or a lender says, in addition to the financial statements, I need this additional information released. It's not accompanying, but it's required supplementary information. On that information, the auditor performs limited procedures and expands the report on the financial statements to show that it covers the required supplementary information. We'll also add an other matter paragraph to identify the information, describe generally the procedures performed, not in specific detail, and identify any issues noted. All right, emphasis of matter. Emphasis of matter is to draw the user's attention to important matters. We're going to put that after the opinion paragraph, and we're going to discuss whatever the matter is that needs emphasis. All right, what other issues might we run across in the performance of an audit? So we've got comparative financial statements. Typically, we're going to issue a financial statement that's going to cover this year and last year, or sometimes this year, last year, and the prior year. The audit report should cover all years presented in the comparative form. So if they present this year and last year, the audit report's got to cover this year and last year. I can't say my audit report only covers this year when I know that those are going to be presented side by side with prior years. If I'm a continuing auditor, I prepared the audit last year, I was able to issue the standard unmodified report. I performed the audit for this year. Standard unmodified report is indicated. Then I just update my opinion on the prior years. No particular issues exist with respect to that. On the other hand, if the previous opinion is no longer appropriate, then I've got to revise that in the current report. You may have this where situations where I gave an unqualified opinion before but realized that that's no longer appropriate, or more likely what you'll have is the opinion before was a qualified or adverse opinion, and now I'm able to issue a standard unmodified opinion. That would be the situation that you would have where you've got a client where you were not able to issue an unmodified opinion the first year that you performed audit services for the client. So for example, you had a qualification because you were not able to observe beginning inventories. So the first year qualified opinion, second year an unmodified opinion, and we're going to note that in the audit report, because our audit report's got to cover all the comparative periods. Now we've also got a situation where we weren't the auditors before, somebody else did the auditor before. What happens if I'm preparing the financial statement for this year, it's got this year and last year side by side. I didn't prepare last year's audit. We can reissue their report with permission. So the firm's got to go to the prior auditors and ask for permission to reissue that report. If we can't reissue that report, then I got to make reference to that report and the opinion on the prior year's financial statements. Sometimes we will issue reports on summary financial statements. We can only issue a report on a summary financial statement if we've audited the full financial statements. When we've audited the full financial statements and then they separately issue the summary financial statements and need an audit opinion on those, what I'm going to do in my report is I'm going to make reference to the auditor's report on the full financial statements. So I'm not going to give a new audit report on the summary financial statements. I'm going to reference the audit report on the full financial statements. And I've got to indicate whether there's anything in the summary financial statements that's inconsistent with the full financial statements. Association with unaudited financial statements. Typical situation here would be that we are preparing compiled financial statements, or maybe said more directly, we are compiling financial statements. We're not auditing, we're not reviewing, we are compiling financial statements. The firm may want to be able to use our name in communication with those. They may want a report on the front of those. What we need to make sure in our engagement letter and in all of our correspondence with the client is we are not auditing, we are not reviewing, we are compiling these financial statements. If we're not auditing or reviewing the financial statements, we're going to issue a disclaimer of opinion. We're not going to talk about the audit procedures we performed because we did not perform an audit. We do, though, have to identify any known departures from GAAP. The expectation is, as a CPA, if I compile financial statements for a client, those financial statements, even if they're unaudited, will be prepared in accordance with GAAP, or I will identify any known departures. Independence. Occasionally, we'll have a situation where we've accepted the engagement, fully qualified with no independence issues, and then something happens to compromise independence. Sometimes it's because lawsuits come up, and sometimes more recently we saw one with a Big Four firm where they had started the audit, and then one of the auditors developed a personal relationship with the CFO, and the independence was compromised. When we have that kind of a situation, we're going to, in our report, we're going to describe that in a single paragraph, and we're going to indicate that we are not independent, but we're not going to get into the details about why independence is lacking. We don't have to disclose dates of engagement and wedding dates in the audit report. That's a rare instance, but occasionally you'll start into an audit and independence will be compromised. Usually an unfortunate situation in some ways. And then we close out with a summary of the information that we've covered to this point.